The last text Maren Holloway ever sent her sister came at 9:17 on the night of October 12th, 2017, and it was the kind of message a person writes without thinking, because they assume they will write 1,000 more just like it. It said, on break, kicked off my shoes. Tell Mom the casserole was good. Love you. There was a small heart at the end. There was a typo she had not bothered to correct, a missing apostrophe in the word moms. There was the comfortable shorthand of two people who had grown up sharing a bathroom, sharing a bedroom, sharing a language of half-sentences that meant entire conversations to anyone who had been raised in the same small kitchen, in the same small house, on the same narrow street in Allensville, West Virginia. The message arrived on the phone of Bryn Holloway at 9:17 and 22 seconds, and Bryn read it while she was folding laundry on her living room couch, and she smiled the way you smile at something you barely register, and she set the phone face up on the coffee table beside her, and she went back to folding the small striped shirts of her 2-year-old son. She kept her phone face up on the table that night the way she kept her phone face up on the table every night, because Maren worked the overnight shift at Wexford Regional Medical Center, and the rule between them, established without ever being spoken, was that Maren would text at her break and Bryn would text back when she woke up, and if either one of them needed something between those hours, the message would be there, waiting, face up, the screen visible from across the room. Bryn was 28 years old that night. She worked as a substitute teacher at the elementary school on Pine Street. She had a habit of touching her wedding ring with her thumb when she was thinking, turning it once around her finger, a small private movement she did not know she was doing. Her sister Maren was 31 years old, 6 months pregnant with her first child, a girl they had already named Hazel, and she had been a labor and delivery nurse at Wexford for 9 years. The two sisters spoke on the phone every morning at 6:30, when Maren was driving home from her shift and Bryn was making her son's breakfast. The phone call lasted as long as the drive lasted, which was 22 minutes, and it had happened every weekday for the entire 9 years Maren had worked the overnight. And Bryn could have told you the exact mile marker on Route 19, where Maren's voice would always get a little softer, because she was driving past the river, and she liked the river, and the exact intersection in town where Maren would say, "I have to focus for a second," because the light there had a delayed sensor, and she did not trust it. That phone call was the architecture of Bryn's morning. It was the thing that began the day. The morning of October 13th, 2017, the phone did not ring. Bryn noticed it at 6:41. She was standing at the stove cracking an egg into a pan, and she paused with the eggshell in her hand, and she looked at the phone face up on the counter and she thought, the shift must have run long. Sometimes a delivery runs long. She will call when she is in the car. She set the eggshell down. She finished making her son's breakfast. She told herself the story about the long delivery, and she believed it for the first 20 minutes, and she half believed it for the next 20, and by 7:30 she had stopped believing it at all. She called Maren's phone, and it rang twice, and went to voicemail. She called the hospital, and she asked for the labor and delivery floor, and a woman she did not know answered, and said she would check. And Bryn heard the woman set the phone down. And she heard the long quiet of a hospital corridor through the receiver, and then the woman came back and said, "Ma'am, the charge nurse says Maren clocked out at 5:45 this morning. She should have been home almost 2 hours ago." Bryn was sitting at her kitchen table by then. She was still holding her thumb against her wedding ring without realizing it. The light in the kitchen was the soft particular gold that the kitchen had every morning in October, and her son was making a small sound to himself in his high chair, and her hand picked up the phone and dialed the number of the West Virginia State Police, and the part of her that had still been rationalizing dropped away in a single quiet movement, like a sheet sliding off a piece of furniture in a closed room. The trooper who took her call was named Davin Reese, and he was 34 years old, and he had the kind of voice that did not rush anyone. He listened. He took notes. He told her that he would drive to the hospital himself. He did not promise anything. Bryn was grateful for that. Within the hour, 2 cruisers and a county detective were at Wexford Regional, and within 2 hours the parking lot had been cordoned off in the section where Marin's car was still parked. The car, a silver Honda Civic with a small dent on the rear bumper from a parking lot fender bender 3 years earlier, was sitting in space C14 of the staff lot, locked, the windows up. Nothing on the seats but a paperback novel face down, with the spine cracked at page 143. Marin's purse was not inside the car. Her phone was not inside the car. Her hospital badge was not inside the car. Marin had clocked out at 5:45, and the security footage from the staff exit confirmed that she had walked out the side door at 5:48, and she had walked through the parking lot in the direction of her car, and at 5:50 she had walked out of the frame of the last camera that covered the lot, and after 5:50 the only camera that might have seen her was the one on the maintenance shed at the south edge of the property, and that camera, the detective would later note in his initial report, had been malfunctioning for approximately 3 weeks and was scheduled to be repaired the following Monday. The investigation began that morning and would continue in various forms and with diminishing intensity for 7 years. By the end of the first week, the West Virginia State Police had interviewed 41 Wexford Regional employees and reviewed every camera in a 4-block radius of the hospital. By the end of the first month, the county had brought in cadaver dogs to sweep the hospital grounds and the riverbank that ran along the back of the property, and divers had searched a section of the Mud River where it bent close to the hospital's rear lot. Nothing was found. By the end of the third month, the lead detective on the case, a woman named Inez Marrow, age 46, 21 years on the force, had built her primary theory around a single object that had been recovered on the morning of October 16th, 3 days after the disappearance, from a stretch of brush approximately 140 yards south of the hospital, at the edge of a service road that led out toward the highway. The object was Marin's hospital badge, lanyard still attached, lying on the ground beside a single set of partial tire impressions that had been pressed into the soft shoulder of the service road during an overnight rain. The badge was clean. The lanyard was unbroken. It had not been torn from her neck. It had been removed. It had been placed there, the detective said in the press briefing, with what appeared to be intention. That single object reoriented the entire investigation. The placement of the badge suggested 2 things to Inez Marrow and her team. First, that Marin had been taken from the parking lot, not from inside the hospital. Second, that whoever had taken her had wanted that fact to be discoverable, because there was no reason to place a badge in that brush unless you wanted it to be found. And there was no reason to want it to be found unless you wanted the search to move outward and away from the hospital itself. The investigation followed the badge. Roadblocks were set up along Route 19 and along the secondary roads that fed into the highway from the service road. License plate readers were pulled from gas stations within a 50-mile radius. The tire impressions were cast and analyzed and traced to a common make of light truck tire that, on its own, narrowed the field of suspects to approximately 11,000 vehicles registered in the surrounding 3 counties. For 3 months, the state police worked outward from the badge, and Bryn Holloway sat in her kitchen with her phone face up on the table, and every time it lit up she felt the same brief hot rush of hope and the same heavy cold drop after. In late January of 2018, the lead based on the badge collapsed. A forensic re-examination of the lanyard had identified a small thread of dark gray cotton caught in the clasp. and a textile analyst at the state lab in Charleston determined that the thread was consistent with a particular brand of work jacket sold at a particular regional hardware chain. A list of likely buyers was assembled and cross-referenced against the 11,000 vehicle registrations, and the resulting short list of 43 names was investigated, one by one, over 4 months. Every single one of them produced an alibi. The thread itself was found, after further analysis, to be contaminated. It had been transferred onto the lanyard during evidence handling at the state police lab itself from a jacket worn by an evidence technician who had brushed against a storage shelf. The thread proved nothing. The 43 names dropped away. The badge, which had reoriented the entire investigation, became once again only what it was at the start, which was a piece of plastic and nylon left at the edge of a service road by an unknown person for an unknown reason. By the summer of 2018, the case had been reassigned to the cold case unit. By the fall, the press briefings had stopped. By the second anniversary, the file had been moved from the active shelf to the archive shelf, and Inez Marrow, who had not stopped thinking about it, had been promoted to a supervisory position that pulled her away from working it directly. If you need a moment, we understand. Stay with us, because what a janitor at Wexford Regional Medical Center discovered 7 years later will make you question every conclusion the investigators reached in those first terrible weeks. The years that followed are difficult to summarize, because nothing is harder to describe than 7 years of nothing. For Bryn Holloway, the years had a shape. The first anniversary of Marin's disappearance fell on a Saturday, and Bryn went to the bridge over the Mud River where she and Marin had ridden their bikes as girls, and she stood at the railing for an hour, and she did not cry. Because she had already done all of her crying in the first week, and she had been surprised to find, on the second week, that she had none left. She tied a yellow ribbon to the railing. She did this on every anniversary that followed. By the 7th anniversary there were 6 other ribbons there too, faded by sun and rain into pale ghosts of the bright color she had bought them in. Bryn could not look at the elementary school where she had once worked. She had stopped substitute teaching by the end of the first year because she could not look at the pregnant teachers in the staff room without feeling something inside her chest go tight and close, and so she had taken a job at the public library downtown, where the lighting was soft and the noise was low, and the work involved touching books, which was a thing she found she could still do. She kept her phone face up on the table. She had not stopped doing this. Her husband had asked her once, gently, in the 3rd year, whether she might consider letting the phone live in a drawer at night, and she had said no, and he had not asked again. She kept it face up. The screen was always visible. She kept it that way, the way some people keep a chair empty. She did one more thing, every Tuesday morning at 6:30, that she could not explain to anyone and did not try. She would pour herself a cup of coffee, and she would sit at her kitchen table, and she would set the phone face up in front of her, and she would wait 22 minutes, which was the length of the drive from Wexford Regional to her sister's house. She did not look at the phone during those 22 minutes. She looked out the window. At the end of 22 minutes, she would get up and rinse out her coffee cup and put it in the dish rack. She did this every Tuesday for 7 years. She did not tell her husband. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell the therapist she had stopped seeing in the 4th year because she had not been able to explain to the therapist what the Tuesday mornings were, and the therapist's gentle questions had felt, after a while, like a hand reaching into a place she had built specifically to keep hands out. The janitor who found what he found was named Carter Pell. He was 58 years old. He had worked at Wexford Regional Medical Center for 26 years. He had a habit, when he was thinking, of running his thumb along the edge of his lower lip, a small, slow movement that the nurses on the 3rd floor had been gently teasing him about for 2 decades. He had a son in the Marine Corps stationed in North Carolina, and he kept a small framed photograph of his son in dress blues taped to the inside of the door of his utility closet on the basement level. He had been a janitor at Wexford for so long that he knew the building the way a man knows a house he has lived in alone for a long time, which is to say he knew which fluorescent tubes flickered, which doors stuck in humid weather, which sections of tile would lift if you mopped them too aggressively, which corridor on the 3rd floor had a faint dip in the floor that you could feel through the wheels of a cleaning cart if you were paying attention. He had been on shift the night Maren Holloway disappeared. He had been interviewed twice by state police in the weeks that followed. He had told them, both times, that he had seen her in the hallway outside the staff break room at approximately 4:45 in the morning, that she had said hello to him, that she had been carrying a bottle of water and a small container of what looked like sliced apples, that she had been smiling, that she had walked toward the break room and out of his sight, and that he had not seen her again. He had thought about her in a quiet and constant way for 7 years. On the morning of June 9, 2024, Carter Pell arrived at work at 5:30 in the morning, the same as he had every working morning for 26 years. He had been assigned that week to a renovation prep job in the east wing of the basement level, in a section of the building that had been used as a records storage area for as long as anyone could remember, and was now being converted into additional office space for the hospital's billing department. The conversion required the removal of an interior wall, a non-load-bearing partition that had been built sometime in the 1970s to subdivide what had originally been a single large storage room. Carter had been told to prep the area, which meant emptying the small closet that sat against the wall, removing the shelving, and pulling the baseboards. The actual demolition would be done by an outside contractor later in the week. Carter had spent the previous afternoon emptying the closet. On the morning of June 9th, he was pulling the baseboards. He started at the corner of the room nearest the door. The baseboards came up easily. The building was old, and the adhesive had long since lost its strength. He worked his way along the wall, prying each section loose with a flat bar, stacking the pieces against the opposite wall. He reached the section where the wall met the closet. The baseboard there was shorter than the others, only about 18 inches long, fitted into the small space between the closet doorframe and the corner of the room. Carter slid the flat bar behind it and pried, and the baseboard came loose, and as it came loose a section of drywall about the size of a postcard came loose with it, peeling away from the wall in a thin papery sheet, revealing a small dark gap behind it. Carter knelt down. He shone the light from his phone into the gap. The gap was not a gap in the wall itself, he realized. It was a gap between 2 walls. The wall he was working on, the partition wall built in the 1970s, had been constructed about 4 inches in front of the original wall of the room. The space between the 2 walls was a narrow hollow that ran the length of the partition. He was looking into that hollow now, through a hole no larger than his hand, and at first he saw nothing but the inside of the wall, the bare studs and the back of the drywall and the soft gray dust of 50 years. Then he saw something pale. It was about 2 feet to the right of the hole, sitting against the original wall, partially obscured by a stud. His brain offered him an explanation immediately, the way a brain will. A piece of insulation, a scrap of paper from the original construction, a rag left by a workman in 1970-something. He almost stood up. He almost stepped back and continued with the baseboards. But the pale thing had a curve to it that was not the curve of paper or insulation, a smooth long curve that bent and then bent again, and the curve did not look like a thing that had been dropped or pushed into the wall. It looked like a thing that had been placed there carefully, and as he held the light steady and let his eyes adjust, he saw that the pale thing was not one thing, but several things. Several pale, long shapes arranged together in a way that his brain refused to organize. It wasn't insulation. The shape was wrong. The longest of the pale things was tapered at one end and broader at the other, and the broader end had a small dark hollow in it, and beside it lay two shorter pale things that ended in 5 smaller pale things each, and the smaller things were arranged in a way that no debris on Earth would arrange itself, splayed slightly, the way a hand rests when it is laid down, the way the hand of a person who has stopped moving comes to rest on a flat surface beside them. Carter Pell saw the curve of a skull. He saw the long line of a forearm. He saw, beside it, the small bones of a hand, and he saw, beside the hand, a thing that his brain did not want to see but saw anyway, which was a second smaller curve. A much smaller curve, nestled against the larger ones, no bigger than the palm of his own hand. His legs stopped holding him. He sat down on the concrete floor of the basement without meaning to sit down, the flat bar clattering out of his hand and bouncing once and coming to rest against the baseboard he had just removed. He could hear his own breathing. It sounded very far away, as if it were happening to someone else in a different room. He did not think anything for a long time. He was aware of the cold of the concrete through his coveralls. He was aware of the hum of the ventilation system, which he had heard every morning for 26 years, and had never once noticed before. He was aware that the thing he was looking at had been there for a long time. He did not know how he knew this. He just knew it. After a while, he stood up. He walked in a small circle in the center of the room. He put his hands on his face, then took them down, then put them back. He took his phone out of his pocket. His fingers found the number. The dispatcher answered and he said, "This is Carter Pell. I am a janitor at Wexford Regional. Basement level East Wing. There's something in the wall. I think there's a person in the wall. I think there's 2. I think. Please send somebody." The dispatcher asked him a question and he did not hear it. He said, "Please send somebody," and then he did not say anything else. The dispatcher kept him on the line. He sat down again on the concrete. He looked at the small hole in the wall, the size of a postcard, and the pale curve still visible behind it, and the room was very quiet, and the light from his phone screen made a small bright square on the floor beside him, and outside the small high window of the basement the early morning sun was coming up over the eastern parking lot. And somewhere in the building above him a cleaning cart was being pushed down a corridor, and the wheels of that cart made a small repetitive sound that he could hear faintly through the ceiling. And the thing in the wall, behind the small hole, did not move and did not change. But it was no longer hidden, and it had been waiting, and the waiting was now over. The state police arrived at Wexford Regional Medical Center at 6:41 in the morning. By 7:30, the east wing of the basement had been sealed off. By 9, a forensic team from Charleston had set up portable lights and a containment perimeter, and the careful, slow process of removing the drywall began. The wall was opened in sections, photographed at every stage. The cavity inside measured and mapped. The remains were photographed in situ before anything was touched. The remains were of an adult woman in a late stage of pregnancy. The fetus was estimated by the medical examiner on scene to have been approximately 26 to 28 weeks gestational age. The clothing on the remains, what was left of it, included the distinctive pattern of a Wexford Regional Medical Center surgical scrub top, size small, in the slate blue color used in the labor and delivery unit. The hospital identification badge had been removed before the body was placed in the wall, but a small silver chain was still around the neck of the remains, and on that chain was a pendant in the shape of a half-heart, the matching half of which Bryn Holloway was wearing around her own neck that morning, the way she had worn it every morning for 7 years. Forensic dental records confirmed what everyone in the room already knew by 10:30 in the morning. The remains were those of Marin Holloway. The call was made to Bryn Holloway at 11:17. Bryn was at the library shelving a cart of returned biographies in the second-floor stacks. She took the call standing between the shelves. She did not sit down. She listened. She said, "Thank you for telling me," in a voice that did not sound like her own voice. She walked down the stairs to the front desk. She told her supervisor, in a calm and even tone, that she had to leave. She drove home. She did not cry on the drive home. She walked into her kitchen and she sat down at the table where she had sat every Tuesday morning for 7 years. And she looked at the phone face up on the table, and she finally allowed herself to do the thing she had not been able to do for 7 years, which was to acknowledge that the phone was never going to ring at 6:30 in the morning again. She picked up the phone. She turned it over. She set it face down on the table. It was the first time the phone had been face down on the table since October 12th, 2017. The investigation, reopened that morning, became something entirely new. Within 48 hours, the forensic team had recovered, from the wall cavity beside Marin's remains, a second object that the original construction crew of the 1970s could not have placed there, because the object had been manufactured in 2015. It was a small leather-bound notebook, the kind sold at the gift shop in the hospital lobby, and it had been placed against the original wall beside the body, wrapped in a clear plastic bag of the type used by the hospital pharmacy for medication packaging. The notebook was Marin Holloway's. Bryn identified it within an hour of being shown a photograph. She had given it to her sister as a Christmas gift in 2015, and she remembered the embossed initials on the cover, M.E.H., Marin Elise Holloway. The notebook was Marin's personal log, the one she had begun keeping at the start of her pregnancy. It contained 94 pages of handwritten entries dating from April of 2017 to October 11th of 2017, the night before her disappearance. The last 14 pages of the notebook were not about her pregnancy. They were about a pattern. Marin had begun in the late summer of 2017 to notice something on the labor and delivery floor at Wexford Regional. She had begun to notice that a particular attending physician was making a particular kind of decision in a particular kind of case, and that the decisions were producing a particular kind of outcome with a frequency that, when Marin had finally sat down and counted, was statistically impossible. The physician was Dr. Hollis Varon, age 51 at the time of Marin's disappearance, an obstetrician-gynecologist who had been on staff at Wexford for 19 years and was the head of the labor and delivery department. Marin had been working under him for 9 years. The notebook listed, in clean handwriting, 11 cases over a 34-month period in which Dr. Varon had pushed for early induction or a particular surgical intervention in patients with private insurance whose pregnancies, Marin wrote, had presented no clinical indication for those interventions. The interventions had produced complications. The complications had produced billable extended care. Marin had been quietly assembling case numbers, dates, and her own contemporaneous notes from the floor. She had not told anyone at the hospital. She had written, on the last page of the notebook, in a slightly different ink, the words, "I am going to talk to Dr. Kaysen on Friday." She had been planning, the notebook made clear, to take what she had to the chief of medicine at the end of the week of October 16th. She had disappeared on the morning of October 13th. The brain snap, when it came for Inez Marrow, came in the form of a single line in the original case file that she had read perhaps 200 times over 7 years, and had never once paused at. The line was in the witness statement Carter Pell had given on October 14, 2017, the day after the disappearance. He had told the state police that he had seen Marin in the hallway outside the staff break room at approximately 4:45 in the morning. He had told them she was carrying a bottle of water and a small container of sliced apples. He had told them she was smiling. And he had told them that she had been speaking to someone as she walked, that someone had been in the doorway of the break room speaking to her, and that he had not been able to see who it was, but he had heard the voice say, in a perfectly normal and friendly tone, the words, "Marin, do you have a second after your break? I want to walk you through the Whitmore chart before you sign off." The voice, Carter had said, was Dr. Varen's. He had said this because he had known Dr. Varen's voice for 19 years. The state police, in October of 2017, had interviewed Dr. Varen as part of the standard sweep of hospital staff. Dr. Varen had told them that he had not seen Marin that morning, that he had been in his office reviewing charts from approximately 4 to 5, and that he had heard about her disappearance later that day from the charge nurse. The investigation had moved on. The contradiction between Carter's statement and Dr. Varen's had been noted, briefly, in the file, but it had been chalked up to a janitor possibly misidentifying a voice through a closed door at 4:45 in the morning, and the focus of the investigation had shifted, 3 days later, to the badge found at the edge of the service road. The badge, Inez Marrow now understood, had been placed there on purpose, by someone who knew the security cameras on the maintenance shed had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks, by someone who knew the schedule of the service road and the timing of the rain, by someone who needed the investigation to move outward, away from the building itself, and who had the standing in the institution to know exactly which piece of evidence would do that and exactly where to leave it. The detail Carter Pell had remembered in 2017, the casual sentence about the Whitmore chart, was the brain snap. It had been sitting in the file for 7 years. It had been atmosphere, color, the kind of small specific detail that makes a witness statement feel real. It had also been the most important sentence in the entire investigation, and no one had seen it for what it was, because no one had known until June 9th of 2024 that there had ever been a reason for Dr. Dalt Varen to want Marin Holloway to stop walking toward the break room. The interrogation of Hollis Varen took place on the afternoon of June 12th, 2024, in a small room on the second floor of the State Police Barracks in Charleston. He arrived voluntarily, accompanied by his attorney, in a navy blue suit that fit him well, and he sat down across from Inez Marrow and a younger detective named Tomas Aldery, and he folded his hands on the table in front of him. He had silver hair. He had the kind of face that had been described in a magazine profile of him published by the hospital's foundation in 2019 as kindly and intelligent. He had spent the previous evening, according to surveillance reports, at home with his wife of 24 years, eating dinner on the back patio, watching a baseball game on the television in the den, going to bed at 10:30. He had read a chapter of a hardcover biography of Theodore Roosevelt before turning off the light. He had been, by every observable measure, a man at ease. In the interrogation room, he was calm, not cold. Calm, he answered every question Inez Marrow asked him with the same unhurried clarity. When she showed him photographs of Marin's notebook, he said, "I'm sorry, I've never seen that." When she read him excerpts of the 11 cases Marin had documented, he said, Marin was a wonderful nurse, but she was not a physician, and the clinical judgment in those cases was sound. You would need to talk to peer review about any of that. When she presented him with the financial records that her team had pulled over the previous 48 hours, Showing a pattern of billing that aligned almost exactly with Marin's 11 cases, he said, "I don't handle billing. You would need to talk to the practice manager." When she presented him with Carter Pell's 7-year-old witness statement, transcribed and laid in front of him on the table, he said, "I don't remember speaking to Marin that morning. But if I did, I'm sure it would have been about a chart. That's what I would have been doing at that hour." At one point, about an hour into the interview, he said something that Inez Marrow would remember for the rest of her career. She had asked him, simply, whether he had ever had a conversation with Marin Holloway about the cases in her notebook. He had paused. He had looked at his hands on the table. He had said, in a quiet, thoughtful voice, "You know, I think there is sometimes a misunderstanding among nurses who are very good at the bedside about what the practice of medicine actually looks like at the level of decision-making. I had tried over the years to be a teacher to Marin. She was bright. She had good instincts, but she did not have the training to understand what she was seeing, and I think in retrospect that I should have been more patient in explaining it to her. I should have made the time." For a moment, sitting across from him, even Inez Marrow felt the pull of it, the smooth professional reasonableness of a man explaining a workplace dynamic, and then she felt the cold underneath it, the absolute absence of any acknowledgement that the person he was talking about was dead, that the person he was talking about had been sealed inside a wall in the building where he still worked. He was not lying about what he thought. He thought he had been right. He thought he was still being right. The thing that ended the reasonable answers came at 2:47 in the afternoon. The forensic team, working through the night and into the morning, had taken the plastic bag in which the notebook had been wrapped and had submitted it for testing. The bag was a standard hospital pharmacy bag of the type used at Wexford Regional from 2012 to 2017. It had a small printed lot number on the bottom edge. The lot had been distributed exclusively to the labor and delivery floor in the third quarter of 2017 for use in patient discharge medication packaging. A partial palm print had been recovered from the inside surface of the bag. The print was not Marin's. The print belonged to Hollis Farron. It had been left on the inside of a bag that had been wrapped around Marin's notebook and placed inside the wall beside her body. There was no explanation for that print that did not place him at the wall. When Inez Marrow laid the lab report on the table and slid it across, Dr. Varon read it. He read it twice. He sat back in his chair. He looked at the wall above Inez Marrow's shoulder for a long moment, and then he looked back at her, and he said, in the same calm voice he had used for the entire interview, "I would like to explain what happened." His attorney began to speak. Dr. Varon held up his hand, gently, the way he might have held up his hand to a nurse he was trying to teach, and his attorney stopped speaking. Dr. Varon said, "I would like to explain what happened, because I do not want this to be misunderstood," and then, over the next 41 minutes, he told them. He had asked Marin to come to his office that morning, after her break, to walk her through the Whitmore chart. He had wanted, he said, to give her one more chance to understand the clinical reasoning behind the decisions she had been quietly questioning. He had felt, he said, that she was a person who could be brought along if she were taught carefully. She had come to his office. She had brought the notebook with her. She had told him, in his office with the door closed, that she was planning to go to Dr. Kaysen on Friday with what she had. She had told him she had spoken to no one else yet. She had told him she wanted to give him the chance to respond first, because she respected him. He had asked to see the notebook. She had given it to him. He had read it. He had told her, calmly, that she did not understand what she was looking at. He had asked her to wait, to give him a week to prepare a full clinical explanation that would, he was certain, satisfy her concerns. She had refused. She had told him she was going to Dr. Kaysen on Friday. She had stood up to leave. He had hit her with a small bronze paperweight that had been sitting on the corner of his desk. He had hit her once, hard, at the back of the head. She had not made a sound. She had fallen forward onto his office carpet. He had checked her pulse. He had locked his office door. He had gone down to the basement, where he knew, because he had walked the building during the renovation of 2013, that there was a section of partition wall in the East Wing storage room with a hollow behind it, where the original construction crew of the 1970s had left a gap of approximately 4 inches. He had taken with him a small hand tool from the maintenance closet, to which he had access, because the closet shared a wall with the records office where he sometimes worked late. He had cut a section of drywall away from the wall near the floor behind the closet, in a place where the cut would be hidden by the baseboard. He had returned to his office. He had carried her down through the back stairwell. He had placed her in the wall. He had placed the notebook in the wall beside her, wrapped in the pharmacy bag, because, he said, in the calm voice he had not lost once, during the entire interrogation, he had wanted there to be a record. He had wanted, if she were ever found, for the people who found her to understand what had happened, and why, and to see that her concerns had been recorded, and that the clinical reasoning had been, in his view, sound. He had taken her badge and lanyard from the floor of his office. He had driven it, in his own car, that evening to the edge of the service road, and he had placed it there in the brush near the tire tracks that a delivery truck had left during the rain the night before. He had patched the drywall the following weekend. He had returned to work on Monday. He had continued for 7 years to work at Wexford Regional Medical Center in the same department, walking past the closet on the basement level every time he visited the records archive. He had been promoted in 2020 to Chief of Obstetrics. He had been given an award by the Hospital Foundation in 2022 for 19 years of dedicated service. He had attended Marin Holloway's memorial service at the Methodist Church on Pine Street in October of 2017, 10 days after he had placed her in the wall, and he had spoken briefly at the lectern about what a remarkable nurse she had been. And Bryn Holloway had been in the front pew, and she had thanked him afterward, and he had taken her hand and held it, and told her that he was so very sorry. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and he said, "I want you to understand that I never wished her harm. I tried to help her see. She was going to ruin a department that had served this community for 2 decades. She was going to ruin the practices of 7 other physicians who had done nothing wrong. She did not understand what she was looking at. I think, if I had had another hour with her that morning, I could have brought her along. I have thought about that a great deal." Inez Marrow did not speak for a long time. The younger detective, Tomas Aldari, looked at his notes. The lawyer next to Hollis Varon looked at his hands. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, a car alarm went off briefly in the parking lot and then stopped. Inez Marrow finally said, "You placed her notebook in the wall because you wanted to be understood." Hollis Varon said, "Yes." Inez Marrow said, "You wanted, if she were found, for the people who found her to see that you had been reasonable." Hollis Varon said, "Yes." Inez Marrow said, "You have been waiting for 7 years for someone to find her so that you could explain yourself." Hollis Varon paused. He looked at his hands. He said, "I had not thought of it that way. But yes, I think that may be correct." He was charged that evening with first-degree murder and with 1 additional count related to the death of the unborn child, which the state of West Virginia recognized as a separate offense in cases of intentional violence against a pregnant woman. He was held without bail. The trial was set for the following spring. In the weeks after the discovery, the brain snap settled fully into place for Inez Marrow and for everyone who had worked the case. The detail in Carter Pell's 7-year-old statement, the casual line about the Whitmore chart, had not been atmosphere. It had been the entire case. Hollis Varyn had been the last person to see Maren Holloway alive, and he had been standing in the doorway of the break room speaking to her in a perfectly friendly voice, and the only witness to that conversation had been a janitor, who would remember the voice but who would be deemed, in the rush of the badge investigation, to have probably been mistaken. Maren had walked into Hollis Varyn's office voluntarily. She had brought him the notebook because she had trusted him enough to give him a chance. The thing that had killed her was the thing she had been trying to expose, and the man who had killed her had spent 7 years walking past the wall that held her, and he had done so with the same calm step every morning, and he had thought of himself, the entire time, as a man who had done what had needed to be done. The remains of Maren and the fetus were released to Bryn Holloway and her mother on June 24, 2024. The funeral, the second one, the real one, was held on June 28 at the Methodist Church on Pine Street. The same church. The same pews. The minister was new. The flowers were white. Bryn sat in the front row with her husband and her son, who was 9 now, and she held the small silver pendant in the shape of a half-heart in her left hand throughout the service. After the service was over, she drove to the bridge over the Mud River. She did not bring a yellow ribbon. She stood at the railing for a long time. She thought about the morning Maren had taught her to ride a bike on that bridge, when she was 6 and Maren was 9, and how Maren had walked beside her with one hand on the back of the seat for the whole length of the bridge, and how Maren had told her, at the end, that she had let go of the seat halfway across without telling her, and that Bryn had been riding by herself for 40 feet without knowing it. Bryn had been so proud. She had been so proud. When she got home that afternoon, she did the thing she had not done in 7 years. She went into the kitchen, and she sat down at the table, and she picked up the phone, and she turned it face down, and she got up, and she walked into the living room, and she sat on the couch beside her husband. The phone stayed in the kitchen, face down on the table. She did not check it that night. She did not check it the next morning. The Tuesday morning that followed, she did not pour a cup of coffee at 6:30. She slept until 7. When she came downstairs, her son was already at the kitchen table eating cereal, and her husband was making eggs, and the phone was face down where she had left it, and the light through the window was the same particular soft gold that had been in the kitchen on the morning of October 13, 2017, when the call had not come. She sat down. She ate breakfast with her family. She did not cry. She was not happy. She was something quieter than either of those things. She was a person who, after 7 years of waiting, had finally been allowed to stop. She thought, briefly, of Maren walking beside her on the bridge with one hand on the back of the bicycle seat, and she thought about how a person could let go without telling you, and how you could keep going for a long time without knowing they had let go, and how the only thing harder than finding out was not finding out. She finished her breakfast. She put her plate in the sink. She went to work. Hollis Varyn was convicted, the following May, of first-degree murder. The jury was out for 4 hours. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He did not speak at the sentencing. He sat in the courtroom in a tan jumpsuit with his hands folded in his lap, and when the sentence was read he nodded once, the way a man might nod at a piece of information that confirmed something he had already calculated, and he was led out of the courtroom by 2 bailiffs. He has not given an interview since. He has not, according to the corrections officers at the facility where he is housed, expressed remorse. He has by all accounts settled into prison life with the same calm with which he settled into every other phase of his life, and he reads in the evenings, and the books he requests from the prison library are the same kinds of books he read at home: biographies of 19th-century American statesmen, histories of medicine, occasional novels by writers who are no longer alive. The east wing of the basement of Wexford Regional Medical Center was renovated as planned. The partition wall was removed. The space is now an open-plan office for the billing department. There is a small plaque on the wall near the door, donated by the Hospital Foundation in 2025, with Marin Holloway's name and her dates and the words she was a nurse here. Bryn Holloway visits the plaque once a year on October 13th. She does not stay long. She touches the plaque with the tip of one finger. She walks back out through the front lobby and into the parking lot, and she drives home, and she sits at her kitchen table, and her phone is face down beside her on the table, the way it has been since the day they brought Marin home. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone. These are the stories that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe. There are more coming. Marin Elise Holloway was 31 years old. She had been a nurse at Wexford Regional Medical Center for 9 years. She had been quietly assembling, in a small leather-bound notebook her sister had given her for Christmas, a case that she believed in enough to risk what she had risked. She had been 6 months pregnant with a daughter she had already named Hazel. She had a habit, in the staff break room, of kicking off her shoes during her break and curling her feet underneath her in the small vinyl chair by the window, because the chair was the warmest place on the floor, and she liked to be warm. She drove a silver Honda Civic with a small dent on the rear bumper. She read paperback novels on her breaks, and she always cracked the spine, which her sister teased her about. She called her sister every morning at 6:30 for 9 years, and the call lasted 22 minutes, and the call was the architecture of her sister's day. On the morning of October 13th, 2017, at 6:30 in the morning, the phone did not ring, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the light through the window was a particular soft gold, and Bryn Holloway stood at the stove with an eggshell in her hand, and she did not yet know what she would spend the next 7 years learning, which was that the silence had begun the night before, in a small office on the 3rd floor of a hospital, between two people who had known each other for 9 years, and that the silence had a shape and a name, and that one day, when a janitor pulled up a baseboard in a basement, the silence would, at last, begin to speak.